July 10th, 2026. In the northeastern Iranian city of Mashhad, during the funeral procession of former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, armed gunmen opened fire on IRGC checkpoints. 3 members of the IRGC Basij forces were killed at one checkpoint. A second checkpoint was hit. The attackers appear to have vanished into the city. The Islamic Republic's state media went silent on the subject of whether anyone was caught, which is itself an answer. And the man who was supposed to be there, the new Supreme Leader, Khamenei's own son, who had publicly promised to attend his father's burial, was nowhere to be found. The IRGC advised him not to come. He listened. The entire remaining leadership of the Islamic Republic gathered in Mashhad to bury the man who ran this regime for 34 years, and the person who now holds that regime's highest office was not among them. That image, IRGC soldiers shot dead at a funeral checkpoint while the Supreme Leader hides somewhere unknown, is not a footnote to tonight's events. It is the most precise summary of where the Islamic Republic stands in July 2026. But the funeral attack is only the beginning of what happened tonight. And the most consequential development of the last 24 hours is not the American strikes. It is not the Israeli strikes. It is something that serious analysts have been warning was coming for weeks, and that has now arrived with a clarity that cannot be walked back. The Arab states have entered this war directly. Bahrain is striking Iran. Kuwait is striking Iran. And the map of who is fighting whom in this conflict has permanently changed. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what the Arab states entering this war directly actually means, you need to understand what brought them to this decision and why. For both Bahrain and Kuwait, this is not aggression. It is arithmetic. The current round of direct U.S.-Iran military confrontation began on February 28, 2026, a date that now functions as the dividing line between two entirely different strategic realities in the Middle East. What preceded that date was the accumulated weight of years of IRGC harassment operations against international shipping, against commercial mariners, against Gulf state governments through proxy networks, drone strikes, missile attacks, and the steady pressure of Iranian-directed destabilization campaigns that treated the smaller Gulf monarchies as legitimate targets for coercion. The IRGC did not build its regional strategy around winning conventional military confrontations with its neighbors. It built its strategy around making its neighbors feel permanently, inescapably vulnerable. Vulnerable enough that they would calculate accommodation as cheaper than resistance. That strategy worked for a long time. It worked because the cost of direct confrontation with Iran appeared higher than the cost of absorbing the harassment. It worked because American commitment to the region's defense created an implicit ceiling below which IRGC provocations were tolerated rather than met with direct response. And it worked because the Arab Gulf states had enough internal political and economic stability to absorb the friction of an adversarial relationship with Iran without it threatening their governing structures. What changed the arithmetic was the IRGC crossing the line from coercion to direct military strikes on Arab state territory. Bahrain was struck with Iranian ballistic missiles, not once, not twice, but repeatedly across multiple rounds of this conflict. Kuwait has been targeted. Jordan has faced air raid sirens from Iranian ballistic missile launches that its air defense systems had to scramble to intercept. Qatar, which has maintained an almost incomprehensibly accommodating relationship with the IRGC throughout this conflict, serving as a diplomatic interlocutor for ceasefire negotiations, even as Iranian missiles flew toward its neighbors, was targeted by missiles that were intercepted before reaching their targets, a fact that apparently failed to generate the strategic recalculation in Doha that it might logically have been expected to produce. The arithmetic crossed its threshold. And tonight, Bahrain and Kuwait are both conducting military strikes on Iranian territory. This is not rhetorical. This is confirmed. Islamic Republic state media has attributed the strikes on Chabahar in southeastern Iran to Bahrain and Kuwait. The United States has denied involvement in the Chabahar strikes of this sequence. Israel has denied involvement, and the operational picture confirms what those denials imply. Arab air power and Arab missile capability are now inside the targeting envelope of Iranian military infrastructure, and they are being used. Let the geography of tonight's confirmed operations sink in fully, because when you map it across the entirety of Iranian territory, you are looking at a country being engaged simultaneously from multiple directions by multiple actors, with operations extending from the southeastern coast to the northeastern interior, from the edge of the Pakistani border to the edge of Iraq. Begin in the southwest, in the city of Ahvaz, which sits near the Iraqi border in Khuzestan province. Tonight, an explosion occurred that the Iranian government initially and immediately categorized as a gas leak, a residential building, a city gas pipe failure. The fire department in Ahvaz confirmed it was a gas leak in a 2-story residential building. That was the official explanation, released within hours of the event. It was retracted almost as quickly as it was issued because the target of the explosion was not a residential building. The target was Ali Razaradi, identified as an advisor to the provincial governor in Ahvaz. Specifically, the representative of the Supreme Leader's office within the IRGC's provincial structure for Khuzestan, a position that represents one of the most direct links between the IRGC's chain of command and the Valayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, the entire theological and political architecture on which the Islamic Republic's legitimacy rests. The condition of Razaradi following the targeted assassination attempt has not been confirmed by Iranian authorities. His absence from official statements in the hours since is its own form of information. The gas leak cover story lasted approximately the length of time it took for the international press to point out that modern residential buildings in Iranian cities do not simply explode from gas leaks with the kind of directional precision that takes out a specific IRGC official on a specific floor of a specific building. The pattern of Iranian authorities defaulting to gas leak as an explanatory framework for what are clearly targeted operations has become so predictable that it now functions as confirmation rather than denial. When the Islamic Republic says gas leak, the operational translation is, we were hit, we know who it was, and we are choosing not to say. The Chabahar strikes, also tonight, hit the southeastern port city that sits approximately 100 to 200 miles from the Pakistani border, the same location that American strikes degraded heavily in previous nights. Tonight, according to Islamic Republic state media's own attribution, it was Kuwait and Bahrain. The main port infrastructure continues to take damage. The Beheshti control tower, whose upper right section was already destroyed in earlier strikes, was targeted again. Missile strikes on the Konarak naval facility, also in Sistan-Baluchistan province, the same southeastern region, hit IRGC Navy assets with what Iranian state media described only as the enemy, a formulation that has become the regime's preferred terminology for adversaries. It cannot fully identify, or is choosing not to name publicly for its own strategic reasons. Move northwest to Shiraz, the cultural heart of Iran, a city of poets and ancient Persian history located in the Fars province of the country's interior. Around 7 p.m. local time, missiles struck targets in Shiraz. Brigadier General Ibrahim Mortazavi Nezhad was killed in the attack. Confirmed. An IRGC Brigadier General eliminated inside one of Iran's most historically significant cities, not on a coastal military base, not near the Strait of Hormuz, not in a frontline provincial installation, but deep inside the country's cultural interior. The significance of that targeting choice is not geographic, it is institutional. Killing a brigadier general in Shiraz sends a message that the IRGC's officer corps is a legitimate target, regardless of where inside Iran those officers position themselves. And then there is Kerman. Kerman sits in the geographic interior of Iran, well outside the coastal zones that have been the primary focus of American strikes throughout this conflict. American strikes have concentrated on the coastline, the Strait of Hormuz approaches, Bushehr, Chabahar, Bandar Abbas, the maritime infrastructure that supports IRGC coercion of international shipping. Tonight, Kerman was struck, deep inland, a location that represents the conflict's geographic perimeter expanding inward. The operational target has not been fully confirmed, but the geographic fact alone, that ordnance is now landing in locations that would have seemed outside the targeting envelope even 72 hours ago, tells you something critical about the direction of this conflict's expansion. Military headquarters on the outskirts of Bushehr, the nuclear city, were struck again tonight, confirmed by the deputy governor of Bushehr province himself, who acknowledged a projectile hit the facility. The IRGC's regional command infrastructure in the province that hosts Iran's most strategically sensitive nuclear installation continues to be systematically degraded. And across all of these locations, Ahvaz, Chabahar, Konarak, Mashhad, Shiraz, Kerman, Bushehr, the United States and Israel are not the actors responsible for tonight's specific operations. That is the detail that changes the entire strategic map of this conflict. Read that again. The United States denied these strikes. Israel denied these strikes. The actors conducting tonight's operations against Iranian territory are Arab states, Arab missiles, Arab aircraft, Arab decision-making chains that arrived at the conclusion that passively absorbing IRGC attacks while relying entirely on American retaliation was no longer a sustainable strategic posture. The significance of that shift cannot be overstated, and the mainstream coverage is not treating it with the analytical weight it deserves. When it was the United States striking Iran, the conflict had a bilateral frame that Iran could use in its domestic narrative. The great American enemy, the eternal imperial aggressor, the same adversarial relationship that has defined the Islamic Republic's ideological identity since 1979. The regime has spent 47 years constructing the United States as the satanic external enemy against which the Islamic Republic's existence is justified. American strikes, in some perverse sense, confirm the narrative the regime has been selling its own population for nearly half a century. They validate the framing. They provide the external enemy that the regime's internal legitimacy has always depended on. Arab states striking Iran does not fit that narrative. It destroys it. When Bahrain and Kuwait, two small Arab nations that the Islamic Republic has spent decades treating with contempt, destabilizing through Shia proxy networks, and striking with ballistic missiles, turn around and conduct military operations against IRGC targets inside Iranian territory, the Islamic Republic cannot frame that as American imperialism. It cannot frame it as Zionist aggression. It has to explain to its own population how the Islamic Republic has managed to unite the Arab Gulf states against it in direct military terms. That explanation does not exist in any form that the regime's domestic propaganda architecture can credibly deliver. The Arab entry into this war is ideologically devastating in ways that American strikes, paradoxically, were not. Now examine what the IRGC's offensive capability actually looks like as of tonight, because the gap between Iran's public rhetoric and Iran's operational reality has never been wider than it is at this moment. The IRGC has announced retaliatory strikes. It has threatened every Arab state that supported or participated in attacks on Iran. It has vowed widespread responses and immediate consequences. What it actually managed to deliver was 2 strike areas in Bahrain. Everything else was intercepted. The attempted strikes on Jordan were intercepted. The attempted strikes on Kuwait were intercepted. The attempted strikes on Qatar, a country that has been actively facilitating Iranian diplomatic interests throughout this conflict, were intercepted before reaching their targets. The IRGC attempted to strike Qatar and failed. Qatar, which has been brokering ceasefire deals on Iran's behalf, was still targeted by the missiles the IRGC fired, and every one of them was intercepted. This interception record tells a precise story about the current state of Iranian offensive ballistic missile capability that the IRGC's public declarations about crushing responses cannot alter. The integrated air defense architecture now covering the Gulf, American Patriot batteries, Israeli aeroderivatives, Allied intercept systems, and the layered defensive networks built up over years of investment specifically in response to the Iranian ballistic missile threat, is performing against Iranian launches at a rate that reduces their operational utility to near zero when fired in the small salvos that Iran's current missile inventory constraints force it to use. Iran's most effective ballistic missile employment in this conflict has been mass launches. Hundreds of missiles simultaneously, saturating the intercept capacity of defending systems. Those mass launches depend on large stockpiles, dispersed but functional storage infrastructure, and fixed launch sites capable of coordinated firing sequences. Those are precisely the assets that have been struck across multiple American and now Arab strike sequences over the preceding weeks. The IRGC still has missiles. It still has drones. It still has the mobile launch capability it has been relocating to avoid targeting. But the combination of degraded stockpiles, destroyed storage infrastructure, eliminated fixed launch sites, and the demonstrated intercept effectiveness of Gulf air defense systems means that Iranian offensive missile capability in July 2026 is a fraction of what it was in February 2026 when the current round of conflict began. The threatening language has not changed. The capability behind that language has been dramatically reduced. And then there is the figure at the center of the political drama that is unfolding simultaneously with the military operations. The man who is not in Mashhad tonight. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man being buried in the shrine city of Iran's northeast, the individual who has inherited or is in the process of inheriting the title and authority of Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic, was not at his father's funeral. He publicly suggested he might attend. His presence was anticipated, and then he did not appear. The IRGC advised him against attending, and he followed that advice, while every other remaining member of the Islamic Republic's senior leadership gathered in Mashhad. Read that situation carefully, because every element of it is analytically significant. The IRGC is a military institution telling the nominal, supreme political and religious authority of the state not to attend his own father's public funeral because they cannot guarantee his security in an Iranian city. The intelligence picture that produces that advisory is one in which anti-IRGC elements are operating inside Mashhad with sufficient capability and access to pose a credible threat to the most protected individual in the entire Iranian security architecture. The shooting attack on IRGC checkpoints in Mashhad, 3 confirmed killed at 1 checkpoint, a second checkpoint hit, attackers apparently escaping into the city, happened under precisely the security conditions that the IRGC established for a nationally significant event at which the entire senior leadership of the Islamic Republic was present. Those conditions included checkpoints across the city, a massive security perimeter, IRGC Basij forces deployed throughout Mashhad. And armed attackers penetrated that perimeter, killed IRGC members at those checkpoints, and vanished. The organizations believed responsible include the Immortal Guard of Iran and ethnic minority resistance groups operating in the eastern regions of the country. What is known is that whoever carried out tonight's attack in Mashhad chose the most symbolically devastating possible moment: the burial of the man who served as supreme leader for 34 years. surrounded by the maximum possible concentration of IRGC forces deployed to protect the event, to demonstrate that they can reach IRGC personnel even under those conditions. The new Supreme Leader watched all of this from somewhere that is not publicly disclosed, somewhere in a bunker, somewhere in a hardened facility, somewhere underground in the same kind of dispersal architecture that the IRGC has built for exactly this scenario. He is, functionally, an invisible leader, announced, titled, theoretically in command of the most powerful security apparatus in Iranian history, and physically absent from the most important event of his nascent leadership. The Immortal Guard's attack in Mashhad is not just a security incident at a funeral. It is a capability demonstration. It is a signal sent to the Iranian population, to the IRGC's rank and file, to the networks of opposition both inside and outside Iran, and to international governments tracking the internal stability of the Islamic Republic, that armed resistance to the IRGC is operational inside the heartland of Iran's northeastern Shia power base, the city of Imam Reza's shrine, the most sacred location in Shia Iran outside Karbala in Iraq. If armed anti-IRGC operations can be conducted in Mashhad on the night of Khamenei's burial, they can be conducted anywhere. 3 simultaneous pressure tracks are converging on the Islamic Republic tonight, with a force and from a breadth of directions that has no precedent in this conflict's history. The military track has transformed in character with the Arab states' entry as direct belligerents. This is no longer a U.S.-Iran conflict in which Arab Gulf states play supporting roles of varying levels of explicitness. Bahrain is striking Iranian territory. Kuwait is striking Iranian territory. American Central Command's operational picture now includes Allied Arab air power as an active participant in the degradation campaign against IRGC infrastructure. And critically, the United States has confirmed it is preparing for weeks of strikes. Not days, weeks. The American military establishment is signaling openly that the targeting package being executed against Iranian military infrastructure is not approaching a natural endpoint. It is approaching a sustained operational tempo that will continue expanding in geographic scope and target depth until the strategic objective, the elimination of Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz navigation, is achieved, or political settlement is reached that achieves the equivalent. The economic track is compounding every hour, with Chabahar continuing to take damage from Arab strikes in addition to American strikes, with Bushehr's power infrastructure degraded, with the IRGC's naval capability in the Strait being systematically reduced, with global shipping insurance markets now pricing in the reality of a multi-week or multi-month American military campaign against Iranian territory, the economic pressure on the Islamic Republic is not static. It is accelerating. Every port installation struck, every power plant taken offline, every commercial corridor made inoperable compounds. The pressure on an Iranian economy that was already operating at the edge of fiscal sustainability before the first bomb of this conflict fell. The psychological track is where tonight's events have produced the most concentrated and potentially the most consequential damage to the Islamic Republic's position. An invisible new supreme leader who cannot attend his own father's funeral. IRGC members shot dead at checkpoints in the holiest Shia city in Iran, while the regime's leadership is gathered for a nationally televised burial. Arab states, the neighbors of the IRGC, has spent decades treating as subordinate, as manipulable, as permanently deterrable, now conducting military operations on Iranian territory. A $100 million bounty announced by pro-regime state media for the assassination of the American president, a declaration that functions less as a credible threat than as a measure of how completely the regime has lost strategic leverage and is substituting theatrical declarations for operational capacity. The psychological damage to the IRGC's domestic legitimacy narrative, the one in which the Islamic Republic is a powerful, defiant, invincible force that Arab monarchs fear and American administrations cannot suppress, is not recoverable on any short timeline. Here is the honest strategic picture as of the night of July 10, 2026, without the official narratives of either side distorting its lines. The United States military has confirmed it is preparing for weeks of continued operations. That language, according to the observable pattern of how ceasefire dynamics have operated in this conflict, may or may not be followed by a brokered pause. Qatar and Pakistan have functioned as the IRGC's diplomatic lifeline throughout this conflict. And that function has not been eliminated, but the week's language represents something the American side has not stated this explicitly in previous rounds, a public commitment to a sustained campaign duration that removes the option of a quick IRGC retaliation and ceasefire sequence, resetting the board to the previous position. There will be no reset to the pre-February 28th position. That is not the American military's framing. It is the Islamic Republic's own framing, stated through state media. Neither side believes the board can be reset. Both sides are operating as if the current conflict has a terminal endpoint rather than a return to status quo. The American terminal endpoint is the elimination of Iranian capability to threaten Hormuz navigation. The IRGC's stated terminal endpoint is regime survival, which it has defined as either total victory or total destruction, a binary that leaves no functional negotiating space. Into that terminal logic, the Trump-Netanyahu phone call adds one additional complication that the broader coverage is not fully integrating. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu raised concerns with President Trump about Turkey, and specifically about Erdogan's public statements regarding the destruction of the Jewish nation. Turkey is becoming not just a rhetorical problem, but a geographic one. Turkish ambitions in Syria, including the establishment of military bases in Syrian territory that would place Turkish forces in closer geographic proximity to Israeli territory than any previous arrangement, are developing on a timeline that Israeli planners are watching with acute concern. The U.S.-Israel relationship remains the bedrock of the regional security architecture, and making that bilateral concern about Turkey public through a disclosed phone call is a deliberate signal to Ankara that its increasing hostility to Israel is being noted, logged, and discussed at the highest level of the American-Israeli alliance. Turkey's position in this conflict is not direct military participation, but Turkey hosts NATO infrastructure, controls Bosphorus passage, and wields regional influence that can shape the conflict's diplomatic environment in ways that neither military strikes nor missile intercepts can address. Erdogan's hostility to Israel, his rhetorical accommodation of the broader anti-American current in the region, and Turkish ambition in Syria create a secondary pressure track that the American-Israeli axis is being forced to manage simultaneously with the primary Iranian military campaign. And then there are Qatar and Pakistan. These two states represent the Islamic Republic's last functioning diplomatic lifelines. Qatar continues to serve as a ceasefire broker, despite being a target of Iranian missiles. Pakistan maintains a relationship with the IRGC that has not been severed by the conflict. These two relationships, one driven by Qatari geopolitical positioning that values its mediator role regardless of the behavior of the parties being mediated, one driven by Pakistani calculations about regional stability and the risks of a regime collapse in Iran producing refugee flows and instability across a shared border, constitute the diplomatic architecture through which any ceasefire deal would have to be channeled. Understanding those two actors is essential to understanding what a temporary pause in this conflict would require, and whether the current military momentum is heading toward one. The structural risk that sits at the center of all of this is not the next round of Arab strikes on Iranian coastal infrastructure. It is the command continuity problem inside Iran as it now visibly manifests. Tonight, the new supreme leader was invisible. The IRGC that is supposed to report to him, take direction from him, execute his will as the Valier Faqih, the guardian jurist, told him to hide during his own father's funeral. The institution that is supposed to serve the supreme leader is making survival decisions on his behalf and for him. That is not a command relationship in which the supreme leader commands. That is a command relationship in which the institution has assumed the function of protecting the nominally supreme authority from the consequences of the situation that institution's own actions have created. An IRGC that is advising its supreme leader to be invisible is an IRGC that is managing its political leadership rather than being managed by it. The operational independence that the IRGC has always maintained is now extending into the domain of political decision-making at the highest level. Who is actually in charge of escalation decisions tonight? The invisible supreme leader in an undisclosed location, or the IRGC commanders in bunkers who told him not to come to Mashhad? That question does not have a clean answer. And unclean answers in the command structures of states with ballistic missiles and regional proxy networks are where the scenarios that nobody planned for are born. In Mashhad tonight, they buried a man who spent 34 years as the most powerful figure in one of the Middle East's most consequential states. The burial was disrupted. 3 IRGC soldiers were shot dead at checkpoints. A second checkpoint was attacked. The attackers disappeared. The man who inherited the dead supreme leader's authority did not come. The funeral of the Islamic Republic's founder-era leadership is being held under gunfire in a country where Arab missiles are landing and American bombs have been falling for weeks. While the new leader hides in an unknown location, and Arab states that the IRGC spent decades terrorizing are now striking IRGC installations on Iranian soil. The IRGC told the supreme leader it wasn't safe to bury his own father in public. That sentence contains everything you need to know about where the Islamic Republic stands tonight. The new leader is invisible. The old leader is buried under gunfire. The Arab states are no longer watching from the sidelines. And whatever the IRGC decides to do next, from bunkers, without its supreme leader present, with its ballistic missile stockpiles degraded and its navy being systematically destroyed and its generals being killed in Shiraz, it will make that decision in the dark, in hiding, with no external audience able to verify who exactly is making it or what authority they actually carry. The funeral is over. The silence from the new supreme leader is not. What the mainstream coverage is consistently failing to integrate is the cumulative institutional damage that tonight's events inflict on the one thing the IRGC cannot replace with a missile or a drone: its claim to operational invincibility inside Iranian territory. The IRGC has built its domestic legitimacy on a specific foundation. It is not loved by the Iranian population. It is not, in any meaningful sense, democratically legitimate. It does not derive its authority from the consent of the governed in any version of that phrase that functions outside of the Islamic Republic's own constitutional architecture. What it has always derived its authority from, and what has allowed it to suppress, intimidate, imprison, torture, and execute dissent for 4 decades, is the credible projection of total control. The IRGC survives politically because it presents itself as an unbeatable internal security apparatus. You cannot fight it. You cannot evade it. You cannot organize against it without being found, infiltrated, and destroyed. That image of total penetration, total surveillance, total coercive capability has been the IRGC's most important strategic asset inside Iran, more important than its missiles, more important than its proxies, more important than its economic empire. Tonight, in Mashhad, armed fighters penetrated a security perimeter that the IRGC established around the burial of its former supreme leader, killed members of the IRGC at checkpoints, and disappeared without being captured. That did not happen at a remote installation or a peripheral military base in a province the IRGC has difficulty policing. It happened in the middle of a nationally significant event in the most heavily secured Iranian city of the year, surrounded by the maximum deployment of IRGC forces that any single Iranian event receives. And the IRGC could not stop it. That failure has an audience far beyond the international press corps covering it tonight. It has an audience of 89 million Iranians who have spent decades being told that resistance is futile, that the IRGC sees everything and reaches everywhere, that there is no gap in the coverage, no crack in the wall, no moment of vulnerability in the most comprehensive internal security apparatus in the region. Tonight demonstrated that the wall has cracks. Tonight demonstrated that there are moments of vulnerability. Tonight demonstrated that people are finding those cracks and those moments and using them. The implications of that demonstration for the IRGC's internal legitimacy calculus are not immediate and visible. They are slow and structural. They accumulate over time in the consciousness of a population that is watching its supreme leader hide from his own father's funeral while gunmen operate freely in the most secured Iranian city. The accumulation is not linear. It does not produce predictable outcomes on a predictable timeline. But institutions that lose the credible projection of invincibility do not recover it quickly, and they do not recover it at all when the events eroding it are happening simultaneously on multiple fronts. Military degradation from the air, economic strangulation from sanctions and port destruction, political isolation from Arab states turning active against them, and now internal armed resistance in Mashhad. There's also the matter of what the Ahvaz assassination attempt against Ali Razaradi tells you about the operational sophistication of anti-IRGC elements inside Iran right now. Razaradi was not a public figure in the sense that a minister or a general might be. He was the Valayat-e-Faqih representative in the IRGC's provincial command structure for Khuzestan, the IRGC's link to the theological authority that legitimizes the entire institution. Targeting him required detailed knowledge of his location, his schedule, his security protocols, and his residential or operational premises. Targeting him required a network capable of acquiring and acting on that intelligence inside one of Iran's most IRGC-saturated provinces. Khuzestan is the province that produces the majority of Iran's oil wealth. The IRGC's presence in Ahvaz is not light. Its surveillance and security architecture in the city is substantial. And yet tonight, someone with detailed intelligence and operational capability carried out a targeted strike on a specific IRGC official in that city, and the regime's first response was to announce a gas leak.